All right, everybody, welcome back. Just picking up where I left off there in video number 1. The reason that empathizing here with the students was so important is because it changed my perception of the problem, right? It's not that students were entirely apathetic. It's that half of them were just insecure about the process. And so that really helped me with stage 2, which is to define the problem as close to the reality of the problem as we can. You want to identify the clear, specific challenge in the form of a problem statement and do so in a way such that it's rooted in the empathy and the insights that you learned from your students or your end users. Try to frame it as a how might I do this, or what's really going on here type of a question. So with me, for direct instruction and choral responses, I made this problem statement. Because they are unsure of how to respond or when to respond, my students aren't fully participating in choral response activities, resulting in low energy lessons, and an unclear assessment of their understanding and missed opportunities for student engagement. So I went on to say, how might I then make choral responses feel more safe and meaningful for all my students? And this really frames the problem I was having in the proper light, in the light of, well, it's not about apathy, it's about insecurity. Insecurity stemming from something I was doing with direct instruction. So I've clearly defined the problem. Now I can go ahead and move on to stage 3, which is called ideation. You brainstorm a bunch of solutions. No judgments here. Go for quantity. You want to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Think creatively. Don't be shy about collaborating with peers and others as you're coming up with as many ideas and as wild of ideas as you can. So in my example, I came up with 8 different things that I could have done to try to address the poor choral responses that I was getting with students, ranging from, my signal to think time to different sort of rewards and incentives. And obviously you can't prototype all of this and test all of this. So now you got to pare things down. Once you have a bunch of ideas floating around, you got to see what's best. And the tool I like to use for this is called a SWOT analysis, where you identify for each of your solutions, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what are the potential threats associated with that solution. So I'll just do this with one. Add group incentives tied to volume or accuracy. In other words, like candy or class parties if they're doing a really good job. So in the SWOT analysis, I'd go through and start with strengths. If I give out candy, if their participation rate is high, that's a good external motivation. If there's some students in the class who really want to earn that class party, then they're going to put some peer pressure maybe on the rest of the class to perform, and you get some allies from the students. So that could also be a strength. Weaknesses with this strategy, it requires time, class time if it's a party, your time if you got to go out and buy candy every week, which of course costs money. Big one here, it doesn't address the defined problem. Throwing a party for students might motivate the ones who are apathetic, but it's not going to help the students who aren't responding, because they don't know what to say or they don't know when to say it. So that's a real weakness of this solution. Opportunities, like we said, it might encourage the students who aren't responding because of apathy, and it could also maybe build some class rapport between the students and I if we have parties and there's candy. Threats here, candy's always messy, parties are messy, They can end up being a distraction from the learning if they take too much class time or the students get too focused on that. And so then I would kind of look at this in totality and decide whether or not the juice is worth the squeeze on this particular solution. And I think if for no other reason than that it doesn't really address the problem I'm seeking to fix, I don't think this is a good one. So I would kind of throw out this solution and then go through and swat some of the others. And after I've swatted all of those solutions, I'm going to end up with just a few, or the best few, that I can then create a prototype for. So you choose a few good ideas and you build a small, simple, workable solution around those best ideas. Focus on improvement here, not perfection right out of the gate. You're not trying to have a perfect model. You just want something that you can quickly test, ideally for low cost, and hope that you see improvements. For my prototype plan, I decided on just a handful of things that I would try differently. I was going to start by putting vocab terms or things I wanted to rep in bold red font on my PowerPoint slides. That would give those students just one more way to know what I wanted them to say. I also developed this new signal where I would pose a question to the students, and then I would raise up my hand like this to indicate I was going to snap my fingers, and that was like a visual cue to them that I expect a response. And to give them think time, in my head I would count down silently from 3. 3, 2, 1, and then I would snap. And I was going to start with depth of knowledge 1 questions that first week, just basic recall, really low-hanging fruit, easy softball questions, just to see if I couldn't get that participation rate to increase. So that was my solution that I prototyped, and we moved on from there to the testing phase. I had to try it in the classroom, get feedback from the students, and then reflect, revise, and iterate my design based on that feedback about what worked and what didn't. Hopefully the students will be forthcoming with that. And this is that sort of recursive or iterative process where even though you've tested it and you've collected some data, it doesn't mean you're not going to go back to the drawing board, redesign, retest, and just keep that cycle going. To gather data in my case, I asked an instructional coach to scan the room and help me track participation rates for a week. I also did some thumbs up, thumbs down activities and exit slips with the students to get their insights about how things were changing. And I wanted to define for myself what success would look like. Where is the yardstick for success? And for me, that meant most students would be responding clearly, confidently, in sync with each other, that they themselves, the students, report that they were more confident in knowing what to say and when to say it, and that I had increased confidence in my ability to assess their understanding formatively during those DI sessions. And I'm happy to say that it did work, this plan, and response rates did improve. Now, did they go from 20% to 100% response overnight? Absolutely not. I had to go back to the drawing board and tweak things and improve. And it took years to really become a master. But I made progress that first week. Maybe went from 20% responding to 40% responding. And that felt like a huge victory. The idea here is that we don't just learn to live with the problem and never address it. We challenge our perception and have empathy and learn from the end users so that we can address it meaningfully. At this point in the in-person workshop, I would have participants come up with their own plan and move through each of these 5 stages of design Stage 1 is tough because this is a pre-service training, so they'd have to work with each other on getting different perspectives. But I'll challenge you to pause the video here and go ahead and identify a challenge that you have had or might be having this year in the classroom and challenge your perspective. Try to come up with some empathetic responses for stage 1. Define your problem, brainstorm a few solutions, come up with a prototype solution, and think about how you'll test it and what kind of feedback you're going to gather. And then employ it as the school year rolls out. Do another activity with in-person participants, and I'll just leave you with this. Remember, we don't always see things as they are. We see them as we are, and that there's a gap between our perception of a problem and the reality of the problem. But through design thinking, using humility and empathy, you can narrow that gap, and you can more meaningfully address these seemingly imperceivable challenges or insurmountable challenges that you might be having in the classroom. So thanks again for being here, everybody, and I hope you have a great year.